Hi, everyone. It's Anna Marino here, your moderator. And Ola and I have discussed doing a short presentation on some of my personal experiences in terms of leadership. The issues of, how to manage that private sector, the industry sector and university has come up during our conversations in the last particularly in the last couple of Zoom sessions. And also that whole aspect of working with the community and how do you manage those two entities, in particular with Maslan's presentation in week 4. He very much has taken this path now that he's looking at and investigating on working with industry from an academic perspective. And why I think this is important is because when I was doing that kind of work, that was just my modus operandi. There was no one telling me anything. However, what has happened over a number of years now is that the corporatization of universities has made it more incumbent for students requiring skills and understanding knowledges that where they can actually bring the two together. So you think about government, they fund lots of Australian Research Council projects, which I will tell you about one in a minute. Australian Research Council projects, they fund scholarships, all sorts of. And the areas have mainly been, I suppose, in the sciences. That's my lay observation. I haven't investigated it. However, it is important to take into account that the world, the changing of the world, well, really what we're doing is going back to an era when industry knew what it wanted and it asked universities to, I guess, produce it. That's how. However, what we have lost a little bit, I feel, is that aspect of where we are actually going into universities for pure understanding and wisdoms. However, that doesn't mean that you can't gain wisdoms and understandings. It just means the way you work the system for your benefit so that you are doing, for example, something you're passionate about and very interested in within a framework pleasing, when I say pleasing, supporting the university sector, but also the private. Okay, let me give you the example of the Australian Research Project, which I actually coordinated for the Fire and Emergency Services here in Western Australia. At the time, the CEO, Bob Mitchell, I was doing various various projects for him, and mainly in relation to bringing people together, staff together, and looking at reframing and reiterating the goals of the organisation. And so this meant kind of working with people at every level of the organisation. And I guess my approach has always been, and one that I feel has really taken me to where I am today and maybe further, is you've really got to listen to people. You've got to listen to the firefighters as much as you listen to the executive managers. Positions really don't matter. To me, they don't matter. They matter in the sense of how the world sees you on the outside and what position you're playing. And for those of you who may be interested, if you have a quick look at the theory of social construction, society constructs us and we construct society. If you look at that and look at what expectations people have, even in academia, you don't see an academic really walking around with thongs and a t-shirt and board shorts, do you? No. And this is just, and I'm just talking about physical appearance. When someone says they're a leader, if they're an entrepreneurial leader, they will probably wear some casual upmarket kind of clothing. However, if they are a member of parliament as a leader, you expect to see them in a suit. And these are just, and the same with the women, okay? So these things can moderate over time, but I'm just giving really to take that snapshot, because when you present to them with a project, You got to really think about every aspect of yourself. A quick one, meeting the Vietnamese Buddhist monk who headed up the Vietnamese community here in Perth. I actually asked my Vietnamese colleague, is there anything, any color that is preferred by the Buddhist community that I should wear, right? And she said to me, well, she said, no, not too bright when you go into the temple, not too bright. Gray is a very good color for them. I said, okay, fine. I had a gray outfit. Also, she said, there's a ceremony. And I think we all know these, you know, you introduce each other and they will offer you coffee or tea. And so I go guided. Now, this was something that I did spontaneously. And this is something that I really share with you. Think about it, to really think those considerations. Okay, so Bob Mitchell, CEO of FISA, says to me, Annalisa, I want to know, is there a psychometric test that measures for honesty? And I said, I don't know. And he said, because the current psychometric testing we do for our firefighters is the same one, the same tool that the police use for engaging, employing police officers. And he said, their roles are two very different. And I said, yeah, obviously, you know, because the firefighters are in there to save and help. Police officers are to maintain order. It's a very different role. And I said, well, look, let me contact some people at the university where I was doing my master's at the time, and I'll see if I can find out for you. And I did. Long story short, rather. So spoke to the head of the, was connected via a colleague with the head of psychology. He was the head. He was also led the organizational psychology aspect of a teaching. And he said to me, he said, look, there isn't a psychometric test measuring honesty. However, he said, serendipitously, one of my students has just finished his PhD, and he has actually constructed a psychometric test and rationale, you know, what goes into your PhD, to look and include honesty as a factor when companies, businesses are wanting to employ someone in terms of a capability. So, you know, communication will always come up. And have a look at what psychometric tests are if you're not sure what they are, okay? Because I think more and more organizations are using them, and it's a good language for you to have. Okay, so we organized, he said, let me speak to another. So he had a colleague and he was in the business school. Then we coordinated. And one thing I did introduce, I said, I want a Professor Michael Levine to join us. And he said, he's in philosophy. And they said to me, asked me, why a philosopher? I said, look, he has done some work for me with, I had a consultancy then, on ethics and integrity. And I said, and he's done some work with the Royal Australian Navy, the submariners. I said, I really think he can bring some real value into this, knowing his work. And they said, I go, just meet him first and then we'll go move. So we did. We met with him and they were very happy. They understood where he was coming from as an ethicist in working on integrity and morals and ethics. It made sense. If you're looking at an organization focusing more on looking to focus on honesty, what you're looking at is also all these other attributes. Okay, so we worked together and I ended up with the role of project research officer, and actually did develop some educational programs, etc., with the Professor Levine. So that's an example, and I'm sure my 15 minutes must be up by now, but that example is really one of where, yes, maybe it's opportunity, but it's also where you think about the skills that you have and always be open to connecting with people and and taking a jump, taking a leap. I mean, for me, and I think I've mentioned that I have recently learned that because I have ADHD, I can look at a problem and see the complexity. And that's, to me, a simple problem. Whereas really simple things, and my daughter reminds me, is that I don't have that kind of like simplicity of thinking. If I see something simple, I think there's a trick there. And in fact, one of the professors who was working on that ARC project, I said to him, you know, I can never get this part of, because that was the other thing. I said to both the university and the organization, if you roll this out, this new psychometric test as a test, so there the university had a captive audience of about 500 or 600 people who were employed. I said, you've got to start the first psychometric test person to do it has to be you, Bob, the CEO. Then we do all the senior executives, and you go down line like that, because otherwise it looks like another thing. We start at the bottom, and then, you know, people going, oh, you know, we have to do it. What about? And that was something that used to be said a lot, you know, why aren't the senior people doing this? Why are we being? So anyway, so that was done and it was resolved. And I have to say there was a lot of success in taking that approach. All right, I think I've probably exhausted what I want to say at this point. Certainly, if any of you have any further questions, because there are other examples of other projects I've been involved in that I have coordinated, you know, you bring things together. And it's about people and networking. And when I say people and networking, you know, I'm not an extrovert. I sound like one when I'm talking because I'm passionate about what I'm saying. And I've heard a lot of introverts talk passionately about their field. However, I can say that I have managed to overcome some of my apprehensions about being not enjoy. I don't like big crowds or anything like that, is by doing this kind of thing where I can address something of passion. And that's why at the last, which you'll be receiving a copy of the talk, the Q&A Zoom we did yesterday, passion is absolutely key. You love the topic you're researching, you love wherever the passion lies. But also remember, passion is one important aspect. However, sometimes we have to deal with administration. Not so easy. I remember saying to one of my supervisors, she said, oh, there's always this administrative things. And I said, look, I feel the same. I don't, you know, filling in forms and papers, and there's always paperwork. I said, but at the end of the day, think of it as something that is revising what you've done and important for others. They want the information for you to carry on and do what you really love, what really passionate, research and teaching. These forms have to be filled.